Good evening, everybody, and you're all very welcome to tonight's webinar, The Beauty of Trees. As you'll be aware, it's Mary Keenan who is joining us this evening to give the talk. Mary runs and owns Gash Gardens Nursery. Mary has extensive experience, really. She's has been a past lecturer in the Botanic Gardens. She has worked with South Dublin County Council in the parks section. She's also been both a volunteer, director, and also a staff member in the Tree Council, and is a tree hugger, I believe. And also Mary has extensive experience in tidy towns, both as a volunteer and as an adjudicator. So we're delighted to have Mary with us this evening to celebrate National Tree Week with Limerick City and County Council with the Beauty of Trees talk. If you have questions, please put them into the Q&A rather than the chat. After Mary's presentation, we will do a questions and answer session. Normally our webinars take about an hour. All right, that includes the Q&A. All right, over to you, Mary. You're very welcome.
Good evening, everybody, and I'm delighted for this opportunity to talk to you this evening, especially to celebrate National Tree Week in conjunction with Limerick City and County Council. It's a very elaborate introduction, thank you, Sinead, for giving me, but the bottom line is I'm a consummate tree hugger. I love trees. And some of you this evening, are joining us maybe because you have an interest in trees in relation to your own garden. Others may be involved in tidy towns groups, but whatever your interest, you're welcome. And for me, I believe, if your interest is in gardening in particular, I think every garden can accommodate at least one tree, regardless of how small it is. And particularly during this national plant tree. I know I saw headlines today of great tree planting that's been done in Limerick in celebration of the week, and Limerick has always been a great supporter of National Tree Week, so well done to you on that front. But this evening I'm going to talk about the beauty of trees. And I suppose to recognise, the value that trees have in our everyday lives, even though sometimes, we take them for granted and we see them in our travels around and whatever. And we're going to have a look just at some of those which, are of great significance in both national level and personal level, and have a look at some trees too that would be suitable for garden situations. This is my favourite tree that I suppose the one that sparked my initial love of trees. It's an old oak tree that grows here in our nursery, right beside our house, and it's probably just over about 100 years old at this stage. And for me growing up, it was my playground. I spent many happy hours in my childhood climbing up through the branches of the tree. It was a place of refuge. It was a great place to hide when mum was looking for me to do jobs or dad had jobs to be done. But as I grew older, I began to appreciate the value of this tree because it was planted by my late grandfather, somebody that I never actually met. I only know him from looking at him in, old brown sort of sepia photographs. But it gives me a great sense of connection with him. And at this stage, this tree has witnessed nearly 5 generations of my family. And I often think to myself, if it could talk, what would it tell me? What would it tell me about my grandfather when he started to plant this little sapling? And I wonder, did he ever imagine, myself and my own children playing in this tree? My own children have a swing in the tree that they hang out of, and it's, get great enjoyment out of it. But this tree has seen 2 world wars, it's seen a moon landing, it's seen all sorts of significant, events in our lifetime, in its lifetime. And we have to think about old trees in this context. They're the oldest living features that we have on the planet. And really, they're an integral part of our cultural and our natural heritage as well. And some of our most historic landscapes have a wonderful legacy of trees within them. The world's oldest tree is something about 9,500 years old, and it's a spruce that's growing in Sweden. And it was only recorded in the late 2000s. Previously, the record had been held by a pine tree in North America that was estimated to be about 5,000 years old. But isn't it phenomenal, to have a tree that's 9,500 years old? I think it's just amazing. We have a wonderful heritage of trees here in Ireland, and Sinead mentioned that I was involved with the Tree Council of Ireland for many years and still am as a volunteer as well. but I also worked for them. And during my time when I worked, I edited a book that we produced called The Heritage Trees of Ireland. And it was a great opportunity to celebrate and highlight some of the wonderful, beautiful old trees that we have around the country. If we look at the sample just here from the book we have on the bottom right here is the tallest tree that has been measured in Ireland. And it's a Douglas fir growing in Powerscourt Estate. It's just over 61 meters high, but a fine specimen of a very large Douglas fir. The tree with the widest girth that we have is this one up here on the top right, and it's a Monterey Cypress that's growing in Inishannon down in County Cork. And right around its waist, if you like, it measures over 12 meters. There's a similar tree up in County Down in Ringduffrin House, and a magnificent old tree like that. The yew trees are probably our oldest trees that we have in Ireland. And generally, if you see an old yew tree, you can estimate that for every 5 meters of girth, every 5 meters of waistline that it has, it's about 400 years old. The one that's pictured here down on the bottom right is in Glencormack in County Wicklow. If you've ever visited the Avoca shop in Wicklow, this tree is actually growing in the grounds of it and has the most interesting sort of fluting and twisting in the bark, really characteristic old gnarled old tree. In the center of the screen here, we have the King Oak, which grows in Charleville Estate in Tullamore in County Offaly. And this is our champion oak tree in Ireland, an enormous old one, spreading right across, but beautiful, beautiful specimen. And on the top right here then, we have one of the largest sycamore tree. When you think about some of the seedlings of sycamore that tend to come up as, sometimes unappreciated seedling weeds, if you like, in our gardens, and you see the size it's going to achieve here. This is just phenomenal. It grows in Gormanstown College in County Meath. And on the next slide here then, not far from me here is the oldest oak tree that's recorded in Ireland. It's thought to be about 600 years old, and I've actually managed to get, you see there's a little cavity here at the bottom of the tree. You can actually get inside in this and stand up straight inside in the tree. So it's almost hollow completely inside, and it's still standing, still producing its leaves away. And it's growing in what was the old Davisi estate in Abbeyleix. A tree we don't often celebrate in Ireland. This is a spruce plantation. And this plantation is also growing not far from me here in the Slieve Bloom Mountains in Laois, in a place called Bon Ray. And these are the first Sitka spruce trees that were brought into Ireland in 1926. They reach now up to over 45 meters in height. And these are the trees from which all of the Sitka spruce that are growing in Ireland, or the seed, they were the seed sort of generation population for all the initial plantations of Sitka spruce in Ireland anyway. And the plantation has been preserved here, but they're just a stunning sight. When we look at forestry plantations around the country, there are mixed feelings on their I suppose, feature on the landscape, but certainly to stand amongst these is really to stand amongst giants. Limerick, or in your own local area, there are also some trees which feature in our Heritage Trees book. And some of these are very, very attractive specimens. On the top right there is an old cedar tree, reckoned to be about 650 years old, growing in the grounds of a manor. And cedars, of course, have this beautiful, characterful, broad branching kind of habit. Now, this one has been through the wars up and down over the years, and back a few years ago in Storm Ophelia, it lost a couple of limbs again. But it's a really beautiful feature on the banks of the River Meg there within the grounds of Adair. On the right here is a beech tree, and just it's kind of a fun, I suppose, example with where the tree has actually swallowed the headstone here. And the girth of this beech tree is 7 meters right around. So it's one of the most magnificent beech specimens in Ireland. And it's growing, say, in the grounds of what was the old Franciscan Friary in St. Nicholas Church in Adair Golf Club. So you have two very outstanding trees in Adair itself. To the left of the screen then here, the extreme left, is a very fine specimen of a chestnut. And it's growing in Kilballion Estate near Bruff. There's about 12 large branches which come from the tree and extend right out. The weep down, they spread right out around it. A fine sight to see when it's in full flower. It's probably about 200, maybe 250 years old. And one of the peculiar things about horse chestnut trees when they flower, the flowers emerge kind of a creamy white color. And when each individual flower has been pollinated, the top petal on it, which is usually kind of a yellowish color, turns pink. And as such, that's a signal to bees that, there's no business for you here. This flower has been pollinated and don't waste your time on it and keep going. So it's a little quirk that nature has introduced in its own right to maximize the opportunities for pollinators. And the rather, I suppose, somewhat, decrepit looking tree in a way in the center then is the Ilchester oak. And, it's not a specimen of any great significance, but there's a lovely story with it. And that's one of the things that the Heritage Trees book tried to capture as well, was trees with stories. This grows in the grounds of Glenstall Abbey. And before Glenstall Abbey in the 18th century, there was a house which stood on the site called Capricullen House. A family lived there called the O'Grady's. And there was a daughter called Mary. And she went to a ball when she was around 17. And she met with Lord Stavordale, who was the eldest son of Lord Ilchester. And his regiment was stationed in Limerick at the time, and he fell blindly in love with Mary. And of course, this tree, the Ilchester oak, was their courting spot as such. And as the romance blossomed, Mary's father became kind of increasingly concerned because he thought, well, he was a poor Irishman, a relatively poor Irishman, and that Lord Ilchester wouldn't allow his son to marry Mary. So rather than have Mary's heart broken, he wrote to Lord Ilchester and asked him to withdraw his son from the regiment in Limerick and take him back home to England. Lord Ilchester wrote back and said, thank you. He was appreciative of the advice, would probably very unsuitable marriage, and he would send his agent at some point to thank him. So the agent arrived some months later and he was invited to stay, and he was very impressed with Mary, but he did notice that her heart was broken. And he asked the dad what had happened, and he said, well, she's still missing her beau terribly, and she'll get over it. But the agent, he was quite charmed by her, and he thought she was a wonderful lady. And at the end of his week's stay, he revealed who he actually was. And it was Lord Ilchester himself who had come in disguise. And so it's a lovely romantic story that's, associated with this tree. He agreed to the marriage, and of course, Mary and her beau, Lord Stavordale, were married, and they lived happily ever after. But it's nice to have stories like that, perhaps in these times as well. And of course, then we have some quirky ones here. The top one on the left there is the very famous Hungry Tree at King's Inn in Dublin. It's a London plane tree which appears to be consuming a bench. And it's a well-known picture that is seen many times around. On the right is a fabulous trunk of a hornbeam tree. And we use hornbeam quite frequently as street trees. And this is growing in Dunganstown Castle in Kilbride in Wicklow. It's probably the oldest exotic tree, as in non-native tree in Ireland, and its girth is over just around 6 meters. On the bottom left there is a quirky one. It's growing at St. Mary's Well in Rosserk Abbey near Ballina in County Mayo, and it's a hawthorn tree which is growing just up out of the roof of an old ruined cottage there. And then on the right-hand side is probably the greatest single trunk castanea or sweet chestnut that we have in Ireland, and it's growing near Ashford in County Wicklow. And the trunk is just over 10 meters, nearly 11 meters all around on that. So, we have just such a magnificent heritage of all sorts of weird and wonderful trees around the country to be celebrated. And each one brings with it its own individual beauty, character, and usually a local story of interest as well. This is another well-known tree. It's Lady Gregory's autograph tree at Cool Park in Galway. And this one has been signed by W.B. Yeats, his brother Jack. There's a list of the people there, George Bernard Shaw, Sean O'Casey, and so many other famous names, in the history of Ireland. And it could be considered an act of vandalism. Nowadays when we find people carving names into trees, we try to dissuade them. But this tree is a testimony here to so many significant figures in our history. In Kilkenny, we have a fabulous avenue of monkey puzzle trees. Again, one of our exotics, planted in the 1840s. And if you look sort of between the trees, if you've never visited Woodstock, you'll see that they're beginning to regenerate the planting as well of some of those that had failed. There are younger trees planted in between the older trees. But just look at the bark of that tree. Never mind the character of a monkey puzzle in its own right. I think the bark is just something so beautiful to behold. You know, you have some magnificent landscapes that can be created with trees. And this is the Lime Avenue at Cart House in County Kildare. Again, just, you know, something that somebody planted maybe 150, 200 years ago. And, you know, they didn't really get to see the magnificence of, you know, this kind of effect nowadays. And that's something that I'm always very conscious of, that, you know, so many of these beautiful old heritage trees that we have, somebody planted them a long time ago. And we enjoy them and we get huge benefit from them. And in turn, we have a duty of care to future generations to continue planting, you know, these type of trees for the longer term benefit of generations to come after us. You know, this is Corca Park in Clondalkin. Sinead mentioned I used to work with South Dublin County Council Parks Department. And this is a lovely avenue of oak trees in the park. And again, in the interest of regeneration and having new trees coming along, the effort has been made here to try and retain the older trees and manage them and keep them in reasonably good health. But in between the older trees, you know, younger trees have been planted and they're coming on, you know, to perpetuate that avenue effect that's there. In ancient Ireland, our trees were held in very high regard, and according to Brehon laws, the unlawful felling of what was known as a chieftain tree, or the nobles of the wood as we have them here, they carried the same sentence as killing of a human chief. And our native trees were defined really in the Brehon laws in accordance with their importance, mainly influenced by, you know, their value in terms of giving shelter, of food, of their significance in terms of the traditional life of the people of the time. They featured heavily in Irish myths and in legends. And under the Brehon laws, we have the 4 classifications here. We have those of the wood, we have the commoners of the wood, which is the next class. We have the lower divisions of the wood and the bushes of the wood. So amongst our most significant native trees here, we have the oaks, both the pedunculate and the sessile oak, hazel, holly, yew, ash, Scots pine, and the wild apple. And then the commoners of the wood, the alder, the willow, the whitethorn, rowan, and birch, and wych elm, and wild cherry. So these would be many of the trees that, you know, we plant and grow and celebrate as native trees. And they have huge connections with, you know, ancient laws, folklore, and traditions in Ireland. That in its own right is a whole story of another day. You know, the tree alphabet was developed in the 4th century, and it was called the Ogham alphabet. There's 20 letters in it, and it was designed specifically really for the Irish language, and also designed to be read from the bottom up, the same as you would climb a tree as such. Each of the markings corresponds to one of our native trees as such. And for example, you have B was assigned to the letter to birch, you have D that was assigned to oak or to the dar, and so on. And you know, you find this, the Ogham alphabet particularly connected and reflected in so many of our place names that we have around the country. With over 13,000 place names in Ireland are associated with trees. You know, you have some of the well-known ones, Pericaria, which is place of the yews. We have Kildara, which is well-known place of the oaks or church of the oaks. We have Mayo, which is the plain of the yews. Adair or Adara, locally to yourselves, is the ford of the oaks, and so on. There's so many other places that we have listed here. Youghal, also relating to you, Youghal. We have Killarney, which Killarney is the church of the sloes, and Cullen Plain of the hollies, and so on and so on. And if you think, you'll probably have many more towns, lands, and areas that you're familiar with that will incorporate some of those Irish names within it. The connection with our native trees is embedded both in landscape, in our traditions, and indeed in our language as well, through the the Ogham connection. It's lovely too to see in southern developments, you know, apart from the older place names, that there's still effort to incorporate the local names. And I came across this place 2 years ago in Dungarvan, a small little area of infill housing built on what was known locally as White's Orchard. It was a property belonging to the White family, and this was built in the garden of the property, a small little sheltered housing development. And with great wisdom, the developers, and with agreement with the council, you know, retain the name White's Orchard within the name of the estate, that it is known locally. And it's lovely to see that, and to see that kind of connection being kept. And I know in many county development plans and in the planning system, there is an effort to try and maintain that connection, although of course there has been one recent debate about that, I think in Kerry, when we had an issue that blew up in the media last week. But largely there is, I think, nice connections with places and the names like that within them. But, you know, for all the beautiful trees that we have and the value that we place on them and the enjoyment we get from them are under threat. You know, so many of these trees that were planted in the 1800s, 1900s, you know, they're 200, 300, 400 of those are beginning to reach the end of their you know, lifespan. You know, certain trees have a lifespan. But that is compounded now in recent years with the emergence of quite a number of new tree diseases. You know, the ash dieback has had huge press coverage, and we're well aware of it. And you can see the impact, particularly I think in the last year, throughout the landscape, where so many ash trees have been dying back across the countryside. In recent months, there was a case of the oak processionary moth, which is a horrible larvae that it feeds on the leaves of oak trees, and some of it came in on a consignment of trees that were brought into Ireland or imported into Ireland from Belgium. Thankfully, the case was identified very quickly, and the trees were disposed of and destroyed appropriately. So hopefully that has halted any likelihood of the spread of the processionary moth at the moment. But in southeast England, it's a huge problem, and it's spreading, you know, across the country from there. And this moth has these hairs on its larvae, which are actually more human hazard than the damage that it causes to trees themselves. And if you're, you know, if these fall onto your skin, they can be very, very, very hugely. Then you have the bleeding canker of horse chestnut. This is the one which I think causes upset, just because, and I'll show you in the next slide why. Again, something that causes the slow decline of chestnuts. There are measures that if you have, you know, old established chestnuts in an area, that if you see evidence of this sort of weeping from the trunk, that you can treat them with biochar, which tends to boost their vigor and boost their strength and helps them to resist it and slow it down. But ultimately, you know, our horse chestnuts are likely to suffer consequences of this disease. Oh, sorry. This is my own village in County Laois, and we have a village at the centre of it, and right around the village grow beautiful horse chestnut trees. And the school is over here. And as a child, again, growing up in the village here and in the school, the chestnuts here were part of, you know, our school activity. We went out in the autumn to collect the conkers and did all sorts of imaginative artistic work with them. But such a lovely feature at the centre of our village, and I dread to think that, you know, sometime in years to come, that we may be without these trees as a consequence of the canker. This is the Lime Avenue that existed on the marina in Cork. It's on the road to Páirc Uí Chaoimh in Cork. And it was planted over 100 years to mark the opening of Henry Ford's first Irish plant. But, you know, you have situations like this then in terms of the threats to our trees, where in Storm Ophelia back in 2017, this is what happened to this beautiful line of trees. They lost a significant number of them where they were blown over. And of course, this kind of extreme weather event also causes people a lot of concern, you know, about the safety of trees. Now, these kind of extreme weather events we hope don't happen very often. We all got very well warned to stay inside. And while it thankfully, the tragedies that tend to ensue from these type of events are relatively limited. It can cause to some degree a lot of unnecessary concern about trees. These are extreme kind of things, but the impact of this has been, I suppose, to cause a lot more trees to be removed and not necessarily meriting that removal. You have instances of this, like where you have the dark hedges, an iconic scene of beech trees as well. If you're a fan of Game of Thrones, you'll know this particular line of trees in County Antrim. And with that kind of fear and worry and whatever that has been generated from these extreme weather events, there's nothing to stop, scenes like what we have here on the right, this kind of massacre of healthy trees. Unfortunately, the legislation that we have in Ireland, the tree preservation orders and that sort of legislation, is more or less ineffective in preventing this kind of wholesale felling of roadside trees. Trees like this can be managed in situation. They can be regularly inspected. If there's any necessary work to ensure and maintain their safety, such it can be carried out, to try and avoid this kind of wholesale felling of trees. The other thing that causes, trees to decline quite rapidly is where there's a lot of development. Now, development has slowed down, obviously, with the circumstances we're in at the present time. But there's a misunderstanding, I think, that you can cut off a substantial proportion of a tree's roots and it can manage life. The two drawings illustrate, on the left is, I suppose, what a lot of people's perception of a tree's growth and roots is, that the roots go right down. And so you can, cut quite a lot of them and hold it in place. In reality, the image on the right is actually what happens with most trees, growth pattern of their roots. They extend way out beyond the canopy, and the tree's most important roots are actually in the top 2 feet, 60 centimeters or so of soil, because that's where the feeding roots are. And the feeding roots are right out on the extremes rather than in close to the trunk. So, with the image above, by cutting off the roots like that to make way for a new pathway or whatever was the purpose of it, you're immediately cutting off, nearly 50% of that tree's feeding and zone and the area where it takes in its moisture, and that will send that tree into decline. So, when any kind of development work is being carried out, you need to consider the location of the roots, the location of whatever has been put in, whether it's digging to install, new pipework or pathways or other sort of built facilities or developments, the impact of it on a tree, and try to minimize that kind of intrusion within the important root area. In my days when I worked at Dublin County Council, I worked with tree management. What I came across increasingly was a huge level of intolerance for trees, and were any amount of reasons that I would be contacted on a regular basis from people seeking the removal of trees. And I've just put a sample of them there, too big, blocking views, damaging services, blocking streetlights, driveways to be widened, blocking pipes and drains, they're dropping leaves, there's trip hazards. So many of these issues are resolved without the need to remove a tree. I would always take the line that if it can be resolved economically from the point of view of councils, because there is that concern as well, but ultimately if it can be resolved by another means without removing it, so much the better, because it's a long time for a tree to reach maturity, and the benefits that it gives to us are enormous. Like in an urban environment, this kind of, you see a lot of these kind of things nowadays, and particularly in the context of climate change and urban living and that. There's a lot of talk about the value of trees. They I see here in this thing, they intercept rain, they store water, they increase property values, they act as windbreaks, they filter pollutants and make the air that we breathe much cleaner and releasing oxygen. They take carbon dioxide from the air and they store it as carbon in their wood, their leaves and their roots. They cool outdoor temperatures, they provide barriers to noisy traffic. But at the present time, I think one of the most important there is that they improve mental health. I mean, so many people are struggling with the restrictions that we live under in these times. And I think there's a great new appreciation for the value of having the experience of walking in a woodland or walking in a park, or simply being able to walk down a street where there are trees. You know, here's St. Stephen's Green at the centre of Dublin. And, you know, so many of our towns, villages, cities have tremendous assets like this at their centre. And this is like the living lungs of the city. You know, it's taking in all of that carbon dioxide, it's giving out oxygen. And, you know, there's a saying or a statistic out there that, you know, a mature beech tree, for example, produces enough oxygen to support a family of 4, you know, for its value in what it contributes in that sense. You know, isn't this just such a beautiful place to imagine yourself walking? As I mentioned, the importance of trees for mental health, and this is a local woodland to myself here as well. And it gives us back, I suppose, a connection with nature, a connection, you know, in these days when one day seems like the other. You know, you've got seasonal change, you know, beautiful autumn scene here. Go back to this place today and, you know, with lovely, fresh, bright green of all the new leaves coming through. It's a place of refuge, a place of time out, and such a beautiful experience, I think, to go to. You know, trees have tremendous value for wildlife. This is in Timon Park in Tala, where again I used to work, and it's a hawthorn tree that was preserved when the park was being developed from the old original agricultural land that the park evolved from. And there's many just sold specimens like this hawthorn sitting. But I photographed, you know, the bees on the flowers here, and the little chicks nesting within the branches. You know, a hawthorn tree is said to provide a habitat for at least 150 species of different creatures, between the insects and the lichens that can grow on, the mosses that can grow on it, and other forms of bacteria and fungi and all the rest. Of greatest value for wildlife, of course, is our oak trees, and there's approximately 300 species of different aspects of wildlife associated with them. And in general, you know, when you're planting trees, we would always be encouraged towards planting our native trees, simply because our wildlife has evolved, you know, in tandem with our native trees, and they offer the greatest support to a diversity of wildlife. But my own view, and it's as consummate tree hugger, a lover of native trees and all trees, you know, I think there's room for diversity in tree planting. And with the new tree diseases and other threats that we have to our trees, I take the view that any tree is a good rather than no trees. So, you know, certainly native trees offer the greatest benefit to wildlife. All trees tend to offer benefit of some sort or other, whether it's for nesting or providing material for nesting, or where it actually has food value, and many other places, many other opportunities for refuge as well. You know, trees in their own right, apart from being a habitat themselves, they also create habitats. And this is a beech woodland in Mount Congreve Estate in County Waterford. And of course, in next month, it'll be just alive with the beautiful bluebells beneath it. And of course, the bluebells are very much beloved by our honeybees and our bumblebees for their supply of nectar. So, you know, when you're planting trees, if an opportunity exists to create small woodlands like this, where you can plant them beneath them with, you know, our native bluebells, primroses and plants like that, it doubles up the value of it from a wildlife perspective. You know, some of our native alders also have huge benefit, particularly in early season in February, when, you know, the pollen in the catkins that you see here are of great benefit to bees that wake up early as such, and the pollen gives them a huge boost of much needed resources at that time of the year, and so too do many of our native willows. You know, these aren't native, but just to give you, you know, if you're looking at from the point of view of a garden perspective, these are some more ornamental types that I grow in my own garden. My late father was a big collector of willows, and on the left you kind of have this kind of curiosity of the black leafed or black catkin with sort of the new buds coming through like little red beaks on it. And the pink one here is a more recent introduction. and just invites you to touch it. It's just such a lovely soft touch to it, and even that in its own right, you know, again, the times we're in, to be, I suppose, have a sense of being invited to touch nature, to go and feel those catkins and enjoy the sense of softness that's within them, can have a hugely calming effect as well. This is a street in one area of Dublin that I used to work in, and you know, if you look there, it's devoid of trees completely. It has no character. There's no sense of refuge. The grass margins that used to be outside have disappeared, and so there's very little or no opportunity to plant trees here. It's a soulless place, and I used to drive along here, and I often felt that the only colour that was in the place was when the residents used to put their bins out on bin day. You'd have blue bins and green bins and yellow bins and whatever else. And you know, a street like this, we are seeing more and more of them, particularly where, you know, there's a difficulty, I suppose, in resolving our transportation requirements, and where trees are being removed to create transport corridors. And, you know, while, you know, I've worked in local authority myself, and I fully appreciate the value of creating transport corridors, it's at the expense of an equally valuable environmental resource in removing our trees to create these kind of situations. You know, there's services in the footpaths here and beneath the ground, and so there's no room in the ground to plant the trees. There's no room for their roots. And all the front gardens here have been removed. There's no grass, there's no place for them. The whole place is dominated by the car. And, you know, the more we progress with that kind of an urban landscape, the less life there is in the city, the less vitality, and really the less, I suppose, it is in terms of benefit, in terms of an environmental benefit for a living space. You know, where would you rather live, here or in this one? And I know I can't see anybody there, but I can certainly imagine the answer. So the ambience, the feeling, the sense of identity even that this particular street has is so much more pleasant than that in the previous slide. And indeed, when you talk about identity, you know, I said, no matter how small your garden is, here's a small house, the front garden dominated again by cars. But the identity of this house is not the door or the cars or anything like this. The identity is the tree in the garden. And if you have somebody driving down the street here describing where you live, it's very easy to say, well, mine is the one with the lovely weeping birch out front. Straight away, it's got character, it's got a sense of place. That's your home. It's even the canopy that's created by the tree gives it a sense of, I think, enclosure and almost refuge in the front garden area here as well. This is my own garden at the height of summer. And you can see, okay, there's plenty of flowers and plenty of colour in it, but the backdrop is, you know, the setting of the garden is really created by the trees, the habitats for the different types of plants that we grow, the local sort of situation in terms of sun and shade is all influenced by the trees. And it gives such lovely, pleasant places to sit as well. And the older I get, I think, the more I appreciate sitting in the shade. When I was younger, I used to love to sit in the sun. But such a lovely variety of shapes and colours and textures again. And, you know, our garden just hums with bees in the summertime, and early morning and late night. It's just wonderful, the bird song, because there's so many trees within it. You know, we plant trees as well to acknowledge and celebrate, you know, different kind of occasions. This is the John Welling in Orison to celebrate the visit of Queen Victoria back in 1860, whatever. And I often encourage people to plant trees to celebrate all sorts of events and to give trees as gifts as well. You know, when you're celebrating, I suppose when you get to this stage of life and you have so many people celebrating significant birthdays, you have all the stuff that you want in your life. And what a wonderful gift to be given is a tree that you can plant and that will grow old with you, if you like, and mark the occasion. But equally, I've planted trees on our farm here for my kids. I marked when they were born, I've marked their first communions, I've marked different events by planting trees, and each one has its own story to tell. You know, this tree here in our own garden, it's a leafed beech, and it's a cut-leaf beech, Vegas sylvatica, Rose obelisk. And our garden, you know, is quite, it's 4 acres, but it's quite a shallow soil in it. And it's doesn't lend itself to growing very big trees. So this is a compromise. It's one which grows very upright, very slender, and doesn't occupy the same degree of space as a huge, big, a beech tree would. And I planted this the year my dad died. And, you know, he's gone from us now 21 years just yesterday. And this tree has grown along in his memory ever since. So in a way, his memory is kept alive with this tree, you know, and it's a figure that's present in the garden to remind me of him every time I visit there. This is a tree called the Handkerchief Tree, Davidia involucrata. And I was involved in developing a local playground in our village here some years back at this stage. And we wanted to put a tree as a central feature in the playground. And that it would mature in years to come and be something that hopefully kids could still climb. Although, you know, I know kids are actively encouraged not to climb for safety reasons into trees and public property at this stage. But, you know, this is a peculiar tree in that it takes about 18 years to produce its first flowers. And we planted this in the center of the playground, kind of symbolic, so that, you know, the children who were playing when the playground was opened, by the time, you know, they grow up and probably bring their own kids along, this tree will have matured and will have begun flowering. And so it's a lovely one, just that, you know, by the time those kids really reach adulthood, it will have blossomed like them into, you know, a full-blown, beautiful tree. It's one I love to give to a newborn babe, because as I said, it takes about 18 years to flower. So it grows with the child, and by the time the child reaches 18 or so, the tree will start to flower just as it blossoms, let's say, into adulthood. This is similar. It's a tulip tree. Beautiful autumn color and these kind of truncated leaves that it has. And this is its flower, resembling a tulip, but a love to it as well. Makes a very fine big specimen tree in time. And it too takes about 18 years to flower. Trees come in a wide variety of different shapes, you know, from very upright to weeping trees, pyramid and round, and all shapes in between. And when you're choosing a tree and looking at it, you know, there are different things which I think can influence the shape, or how the shape can influence your choice. This is the church in Glasnevin, across the road from Botanic Gardens. It's a pyramidal structure. And just up the road from it is the Met Office, which is quite a similar pyramidal structure. But by accident or by design, I'll never know. But in the grounds of the church is a cedar, similar to the one at Adair Manor. And you see it has this beautiful, you know, this lovely triangular shape or pyramidal shape, which perfectly matches the pyramidal shape of the building behind it. And I often think, you know, if somebody has maybe a 1970s bungalow, which has this kind of very steep pyramidal pitch on the roof, you know, the type of tree, if you have a garden large enough that you can, you know, accommodate within it, is something like one of these lovely old cedars, which would pick up the shape of the tree. And, you know, architecturally, the two work really well together. I studied horticulture in UCD, and these cherry trees were there at the time, this lovely flat-topped cherry. But what's particularly striking about it is that, you know, the flat top of it complements the flat roof of the arts block as it was at the time. And so visually, they work really well as an extension almost of each other. You know, if you put vertical, very upright trees in that, they almost jar in terms of their connectivity and their design functioning. This is the County Council offices in Portlaoise, not far from me here. And while they haven't put, you know, the building is quite flat topped as well. They've got a long flat wall here on the edge of the car park. So while they didn't use the flat top cherry here to pick up any kind of the horizontal lines, what is quite effective is they have used a line of hornbeam here, which colour lovely in autumn, and they're just colouring here with the yellow, the green leaves turning yellow. And these two, by virtue of being planted in a line, they emphasise that same horizontal effect of the wall and the horizontal effect of the building. You know, this on the right here is just the Carpinus again, and it's a wonderful street tree because it produces a very compact crown like this, and so it lends itself to growing in confined spaces. On the left is perhaps a lesser known tree, which also produces a lovely compact crown, and it's a fastigiate form of our native oak tree, the Quercus robur. something that would merit, I think, being used in far more in streetscapes. Now here in the picture I have, it showing branches close to the ground, but the trunk can be cleared of these to create a clear stem as you would for the likes of the Carpinus here. You know, these are Carpinus grown as street trees in Neiltown Road in Dublin. And for many years, you know, and back in the 80s in particular, Neilstown would have featured, you know, for many of its, you know, the difficult situations that presented themselves in it. It was a challenging area to live in, and very difficult area from the council's perspective to establish trees within, because they were frequently broken and damaged and vandalized. And then the community got together with the council here, and these trees were planted to celebrate, remember, the so many young people at the time who had died from drugs issues. And each one of the trees that is planted on this road here connects with a family who was affected with drugs in their family life. And when the council worked the community and the trees began to take on a low significance for them, that was the beginning of the successful establishment of the trees in this area. And here they are, nearly 20 years on, maturing beautifully and adding great character in an area that was totally devoid of trees and pine. This is similar to the Carpinus or the hornbeam in terms of its shape and structure. Again, for, you know, in terms of trees suitable for planting in urban streetscapes, in residential areas that have fairly compact crowns. This is an elm. Now we've lost most of our native elms from the landscape, although they do re-emerge in the hedgerows due to the Dutch elm disease that appeared back in the 70s. But these are resistant to Dutch elm, and it's a lovely way of bringing back elm trees into our landscape and very suitable for compact sort of situations. Another very common tree for urban landscapes, for streetscapes and residential areas, are the mountain ash, all related to our native trees. Our native mountain ash, but these are just some more cultivated forms. On the left there is the lovely yellow-berried Joseph rock, and on the right is a white-berried form called Kashmiriana. And of course all of them produce the white flowers here in June, which are very much beloved of bees. Beautiful autumn colour in the foliage, compact crowns, and have been planted as street trees for many, many years. A more recent addition to the selection of trees for street planting is this one, Amelanchier. And it's in flower at present. You see the white flowers on it, and then it produces this lovely autumn colour as well. So it gives 2 seasons of interest. Quite narrow, quite compact in its growth as well, but something a little different, offering flowers for, again, early pollinator interest, and then lovely autumn colour in it as well. Now I mentioned, you know, the upright trees and that are great for compact spaces, but you know, there are also situations where you want to have what I call real trees, real statement trees like these. On the right you have a weeping beech tree, and on the left is a weeping willow. These have the effect of, I suppose, visually drawing your eye downwards and emphasizing the landscape beneath it. So on the right, you know, you see the river beneath, on the left you see the lovely detailed planting that's here. Where you plant vertical trees, they tend to draw your eye upwards. And if that's what you want to emphasize, that's fine too. So, you know, by looking at the shapes of trees and looking how you visually, how they visually impact, can be important in terms of your choice when you're looking at them in terms of buildings and looking at them in terms of the effect that they have. You know, on the right here, you have Acer globosum, which was planted quite a bit as a street tree in Dublin as well. Quite a broad crown, but it's like a full stop. It makes quite a statement even as a tree on its own, a single tree in its own right, and quite an, you know, an architectural, I suppose, appearance with a very compact crown. It's not pruned to retain that rounded shape, but it has its own interest. And on the right, with the purple undersides of the leaves, it's one of my favorite maples. What I love about it is the fact that it changes depending on whether you have a calm day or a windy day. You know, on a calm day, all you see is the surface of the leaf, which is dark green, and on a windy day, then when it blows, you get the lovely purple sides on display like this. Now, it's quite a sizable tree. It's something that you would plant in a larger garden or in open spaces, perhaps in a residential area. You know, we have a legacy of some beautiful specimen trees, even within, you know, our ordinary everyday residential landscapes. These are redwoods growing in the Botanic Gardens, but I lived in an estate in Dublin at one point point in my life. And again, as part of the development of the estate, there were lovely old redwoods that were retained and incorporated into the open space for the modern residential development. And they're magnificent trees. The redwoods been famous for their height and the girth of their trunks. This is another housing estate in Clondalkin. Again, evolved from some old estate that originally was in the place, where you had beautiful old pine trees here, and cedars and Monterey Cypress that were retained right beside the houses here, but adding immediate character to a new residential development, and lovely to have seen them retained and incorporated into the open spaces. You look at the bark of the pine tree. That's one of our native pines, the Pinus nigra. And again, sometimes you have to stop and just look. You walk by a pine tree on a regular basis and maybe you don't see the actual beauty in the bark. You'll sense I have a certain fondness for horse chestnuts, and for planting in large areas, for large gardens, areas like our village green that we have in the village in Castletown here, and open spaces in housing estates. There's nothing more spectacular than a chestnut tree. If space is a little bit limited, you can plant the red-flowered horse chestnut here on the bottom of the screen, and all of them quite attractive to pollinators. Other statement specimen trees that are of interest maybe on the left is the Spanish chestnut, which actually produces edible chestnuts here. And we have some of these in our local area here in some of the residential areas. And the local scouts gathered them in the autumn time for roasting on their fires. And on the right here is the Maiden hair tree, Ginkgo biloba, which has its own little story. It was discovered as a fossil in China back in the 1700s, early 1800s. And so it's relatively new to cultivation again, or reintroduced into cultivation. But it's this lovely fan-shaped leaf and glorious autumn colour on it. But again, something lovely to incorporate into open space areas. This is Cova, a relative of the hornbeam. And this is in Botanic Gardens in Glasnevin as well. But look at the shape of it, even in the winter time when it's denuded of leaves. The branch structure offers its own interest. And this is a close-up of the trunk at the base of it, this lovely grey fluted kind of bark that it has. Now, this tree is probably about 150 years old. But again, I go back to what I said at the start, somebody planted this for our enjoyment. If you have a garden that has a wet area in it, or an area of open space that's wet, obviously willows would be the first choice, and alder too. But this is a lovely ornamental tree that is particularly thrives in dampish ground called Pericaria, Fraxinus Folia. The Fraxinus relates to the fact that the foliage is very like an ash tree, and then it has these beautiful, very subtle green flowers on it around about June into early July. But a very fine specimen too for larger areas. And of course, the real creme de la creme, of state trees for big areas are some of the flowering cherry. Years back, they were planted as street tree, and unfortunately, flowering cherries tend to be quite shallow rooted, and of course they present problems then of lifting pavement and causing trip hazard, and they really aren't suitable for planting in streetscapes, but they're ideal for open space planting in green areas, public parks, and that kind of situation. This is a fabulous Prunus yedoensis with this lovely broad spreading crown and single flowers. The big traditional blousy double flowered cherries don't have great value for our pollinators, but single flowered cherries are excellent value for them. And I'm talking about trees, planting them in open spaces and large areas, large green areas and residential areas. And then you come across what I see as missed opportunities like this. I really don't understand how, things are planted in tubs sitting on grass. There's no place for this kind of planting where you have a green area. The trees should be placed directly into the ground, and there's no maintenance involved then, or much less maintenance, and their chances of maturing into substantial trees are much greater. This is a green area at the front of a residential area, and this is a similar green area at the front of a residential area, actually in Ballincolly in Cork. And just planted with a row of silver birch like this, with the trunks cleared and lifted, so there's no hidden areas within it. And yet, such a lovely place. You'll see how the path through it is very, very well used. There would be no merit in surfacing that path. I think it's just lovely to keep the natural look about it that it has. But it's in a very busy area. It's on the side of a very busy road, and yet such a lovely use of the green area. this is the centre of Dungarvan. And again, as a former person who worked with council, I was involved in many urban development schemes. And I suppose as a tree hugger and as a parks person, we often didn't quite see eye to eye with, engineers and architects and whatever. This type of planting, again, I believe is a total waste of time. The trees in these tubs have limited lifespan. If they survive 5 years, that's it, then, they'll be replaced. And again, the opportunity for creating permanent trees has been lost here by trying to include them into trees. It would be far better to plant one tree and create, a proper space in the ground for it than this sort of what I see as temporary measure. And it's disappointing because so many of our towns, are beautiful, are enhanced really by trees at the centre of them. So here again, I have an example where the car won out at the expense of the trees. You look at iconic trees like these lovely plane trees on Bagot Street in Dublin, and you look at this kind of thing as a centre town streetscape, and there's I think the picture speaks for itself. You have big trees, but certainly they can still be accommodated. And here are huge lime trees on Main Street in Bunclody. Now, what they've done here, in the interest of, I suppose, containing them within the streetscape and maintaining them within the scale of it, is the trees have been pollarded. This means they've been pruned in a particular technique. It doesn't automatically mean just severe pruning, it's pruned in a particular technique. But these two are a lovely feature of the streetscape in Bunclody. You see the picture on the left is, I suppose, again, great effort to try and introduce trees, certainly commendable. But for the longevity of them, there is no real future in planting them in boxes like that. And here again, then you see this is what happens in a few years down the line. This is some new street planting that has been done on the Lewis line in Dublin. And on the surface of the street, you see just, the paving has been put in place. And you see the soft resin-bound gravel is here. But beneath the ground, this is the effort that went into planting those trees. It's a very structured, very engineered solution. But it's a means of putting trees in what is quite an unfavorable environment. I'm not going to get into the detail of the structure of this, but in modern construction, modern engineering, there are ways and means of incorporating trees into what can appear sometimes, impossible situations. Now I'm going to conclude with just some examples of some of trees for garden situations, because some of what I've shown you are perhaps too large for your average garden, more suited to half acre, 1 acre, 2 acre gardens, or for your green areas or public areas in your towns and villages. In my own garden we have this Japanese maple. It's a small size tree. It's only about maybe about 9-10 feet in height. And yet it introduces a sense of scale, if you like, in our front garden, which is relatively small. There's lovely colour in the foliage of it, and it's it brings its own interest in the garden. This is another form of maple called Brilliantissimum, and again it's a compact tree. It's grafted on the top, which means that the stem here is probably a wild sycamore, and this cultivated head has been put on it. And the effect of the cultivated head being grafted on is that it maintains this small crown. So again, it's about 9 feet in height. It's quite compact growing. And this is a close-up of the young foliage as it's emerging this time, with the flowers on it as well. Quite ornamental, but just something, if you like the idea of incorporating a tree with colourful foliage into the garden, it's a nice one to use. I like some of the ornamental hawthorns. This one has been, I suppose, widely available for many years with the double pink flowers on it, Crataegus Paul Scarlet. But earlier I did mention the value of single flowered as opposed to these kind of double flowered forms for our pollinators and for wildlife. So my liking for hawthorns has been somewhat overtaken with this one, which is an oriental type of hawthorn, Crataegus orientalis, that produces huge fruits by comparison to our native one. But it's a lovely garden tree, and this one produces very similar white single flowers to our native hawthorn, but makes it an absolutely spectacular garden tree when it's in flower in May, and then again in the autumn when you have the fruits here. The flowering crabs are also great for pollinators, and lovely small garden trees. They tend to be no more than about 12 or 15 feet in height. with these, pink and white flowers on them in May into early June. They tend to last much longer in flower too than the flowering cherries, which tend to turn to confetti quite quickly. This is a close-up of another one, Malus Royalty, but when the flower has gone, you're left behind with these quite attractive purple tinted leaves. And then some of our flowering crabs produce these fruits then in the autumn, which of course birds love to pick on as well. And there are many different fruits. The yellow ones, particularly the golden hornet, tend to last quite a long time. The magnolias too, of course, make lovely specimens in small gardens. This is just the one tree. I said every garden should have at least one tree, and this owner has taken it literally the only tree they have, and virtually the only thing they have in their front garden is this magnolia. But once a year, what a sight to behold. I have this one growing in the garden. It's a Sophora, and most peculiar little yellow flowers on it, which come on just in the next couple of weeks, really, as the leaves begin to unfold. It can be grown as a multi-stem tree or as a single trunk tree. But something a little bit different for the small garden. If you're into gardening and you're looking for something a little different, it's one to look out for. This is Prunus Paddis, which is related to one of our natives again. And it's a form of cherry, and it's probably one of my favorite cherry trees. Again, this one is growing in our own garden. You see a close-up of the flower here. It's a cultivated version of one of our natives. And what's cultivated about it is that it has this more compact kind of crown. In that it grows. Our native one tends to be more sprawly, more widespreading, but a lovely tree and very good for the pollinators too. This is another form of cherry, an early flowering one. This is what it flowers like at the present time, close up of the flower with the purple foliage. And as the season goes on, then the foliage gets much darker like this. Now, I do caution using purple foliage trees. Fine in an urban garden situation, but if you're in the rural landscape, I would tend to keep purple trees close to the house, because they really are at odds with the natural landscape. Generally, I would discourage people from planting these, very strong colours in a rural situation, and certainly avoid using them, on, say, approach roads to towns, that they just jar with the natural landscape. But in the confines of a small urban garden, it's a lovely tree to include. This is a weeping tree, again suitable for small garden. It's a weeping pear. And so it flowers with white flowers, great for pollinators, single flowers as well. And just in this situation here, it tends to take away from the dominance of the tall buildings in the background, because it draws your eye right down to the detail at the garden below. You don't really see the tall buildings behind. And this is one of the effects of visual effects, if you like, of using a weeping tree, in that it reinforces what that ground level rather than above it. In my own garden, I love these snakebark maples. And what I feel the beauty of these is, you have the foliage all summer long, and then right through the winter, you have this attractive bark as well. And if you have a small garden, you want a tree that's going to work hard for you, something that will give you a few seasons of interest. So like earlier there, we had the flowering crabs, which will give you, flower in May. You have nice tinted foliage in summer, and then in the autumn you have the fruits. With these type of snakebark maples, you have attractive foliage in the springtime and small little red flowers on them. And then right throughout the winter, you have this lovely bark effects as well. And they're quite compact growing trees, again, about 12, 15 feet in height. This is the paperbark maple, another attractive bark. On the left in its autumn colour, just a close-up of the peeling bark effect. Probably for me, the best tree of all for a small garden, because it just gives such great interest with the peeling bark. And if you site it in the right position, where sunlight is coming through the tatters on the barks, on a winter's day, it can give the effect almost of the stem being on fire. White-stemmed birch tend to be grown quite a lot in open space areas. Silver birch, white-stemmed birch are popular as street trees, and they're lovely in the garden context as well. If you grow them in the garden, don't feel embarrassed like I tend to be sometimes when I go out to wash them. You'll see the one on the left here, that's the before, and here's the after. So I tend to wash them maybe once or twice a year, because you have all the grime that accumulates on them from the winter time. But look how beautiful they look when you wash them and expose the white bark again. That's the Himalayan birch, and this is a lovely one. It's a Betula albicinensis fascination with this really lovely pinky orange tint in the bark as well. Another beautiful one for year-round interim garden. And this is the last two trees and I'm going to show you. Again, you know, for more maybe the domestic situation in a garden, but slightly larger garden. These are two of my favorites in my own garden. This is Pericaria, and it really grows like a great big mushroom. My husband loves it because it covers an enormous area of ground, and so we have much less grass to mow. And so it, you know, it offers really a way of cutting down on the grass cutting. The spread on the tree is probably about 20 feet in diameter, and this is its autumn colour. There's also a form which colours red in the autumn called Vanessa like this, and these are its flowers in January. But a beautiful specimen tree, you know, if I have a slightly larger garden, it's certainly one as you're advancing in years that cuts down on the mowing. And in my own garden, this is one which I particularly like. It's the Cercidophyllum katsuri, and I call it the candy floss tree. I love working around this tree just as the leaves colour bright orange in autumn like this, because when they're declining and decaying, they give off the smell of burnt sugar. It takes me back to my younger days of going to Duffy Circus and, you know, enjoying the candy floss. That's exactly what the smell is like. And, you know, earlier on in the year, the tree is just green, plain green. It sits as, you know, unnoticed almost in the background against the colourful borders. But once you begin to get a little bit of cold weather in September, it takes on just this fabulous orange colour, and then the smell wafts on air throughout the garden. Just a beautiful, beautiful specimen tree. This is my dad, who planted so many of the trees that we enjoy in the garden. And say he passed away 21 years ago yesterday. But I think this saying, old Greek proverb, applies to him and applies to so many of those wonderful people who planted those trees that I showed at the start. Society grows great when old men plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit in. What a wonderful thought, and what an unselfishness of those people, you know, that have given us those beautiful trees that we enjoy. These are my own kids. They never met my dad. They're his grandchildren. But the connection they have with him is the trees that he planted for me, for them, for their children, and goodness knows how many more generations to come. Just like the lovely oak tree that I started with, that my grandfather planted, and that I have, I suppose, started my love affair with trees. And I hope that, you know, my own kids take on that appreciation of the value of trees too, and they're allowed to climb them here in our own garden. Just something, there's a statistic that goes around that 1/3 of children between the ages of 6 and 15 have never climbed a tree. I suspect that most of you watching in this evening have at some time in your younger days climbed a tree. Imagine that children nowadays just don't have that fun and that enjoyment that we had. You know, if you need to convince somebody of planting trees and the value of planting trees, this was something I picked up years ago when my kids were small, called the Lorax. And it's the story of a town that, you know, was devoid of trees, and a young chap who was trying to win the heart of his true love. And to do so, he went through a great adventure to bring colour and life and trees back into his town. And it's a great story, you know, where the mayor of the town was charging people for bottles of oxygen and all this sort of stuff where they had no trees. But just, it's a children's movie, but there's a tremendous message in it for adults as well. And if you need convincing, or if you need to convince anybody, sit them down and watch that. So to conclude, National Tree Week, you know, if you have the opportunity to plant trees, great, or at least, you know, if you can't do it now, plant at some point over the next, you know, year. The best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is now, and an even better time is this week during National Tree Week. So thank you for your attention. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you, you know, my love of trees. And I hope you've enjoyed some of those beautiful specimens that I've showed you. And maybe when we break out of, you know, the restrictions of the lockdown, you'll have an opportunity to travel and visit some of those that I showed you, or borrow the Heritage Trees book from your local library. It's a great read. It's a great insight to some of our beautiful specimens around the country. So thank you very much again.
Mary, I don't know what to say. Oh my goodness, that was fabulous. Absolutely fabulous. Thank you so much. And you kept everybody enthralled for, oh my God, it was just wonderful. So everybody, the fascinating presentation, brilliant. Thank you. Fascinating. That was wonderful. People want the talks and slides. That's all in the chat. And then we have some questions as well. And really fabulous talk, Mary.
Great.
Thank you. How to trim old yew trees beside a church? Would you have any advice there? That's from Mary.
Yes. Well, old yew trees, as I said, are, some of them, depending on their girth, you can almost date them. But most of the old yew trees we have beside churches could be well over 100 years old. And really, to trim them, the best way to go about it is to do it in stages. So rather than, heavily pruning them, I would tackle, say, a third this year, third next year, third the following year. Do it over a 3-year period. And okay, it may not look great for a while until, the new growth catches up. But rather than putting the tree under, complete stress immediately, and they can take it. Like, I have seen old yew trees cut back to the stump and allowed to regenerate again. But, if you're nervous about doing it, the best way to go about it is to do it in stages. And certainly they recover quite well. Unlike most other conifers, you hear people say, oh, you can't cut back conifers, you can't cut back into the brown wood of them. You will actually regenerate. If you're feeling brave enough to give them a very severe pruning, you can do that. And interestingly, they tend to have a lot of dormant buds around the base of the branches, around the base of the tree. And indeed, in Corca Park that I showed earlier, we had a wall garden there. We had some yew trees, and to stimulate those dormant buds into regrowth, they were treated with pressure washer, with a power hose, power washer, and it actually stimulated the growth of them. So it sort of seems like an extreme kind of measure, but just washing them over with a power hose actually had that effect with it. And apparently, it's a recommended treatment, perhaps a little extreme. But even just straightforward hard pruning, if you're brave enough, it will regenerate from it. I've seen that them do that as well.
Okay.
So have no fear.
Thank you. So from Noreen, why is there not more strict regulation on trees coming into Ireland to prevent the import of disease? A lot of people ask that question.
Yes, there is. I suppose the regulations are there, and certainly with, I think, the arrival of Brexit, there has been a huge strengthening of those regulations. What can tend to happen is that, the live tree material that comes into Ireland is actually well inspected, but some of the newer pests, especially, that come in, tend to come more on pallets and, byproducts of trees as opposed to the trees themselves. And, particularly in the UK, they have had a huge influx in recent years of some new tree pests, and many of those are traced back, but not actual tree contaminants themselves, but the byproducts, particularly pallets that are coming from more exotic places. But we do have regulations in place. I think that the checks at the ports, particularly since the discovery of that oak processionary moth, have been reawakened, if you like, and they are quite stringent. But things do get in, and there are different ways that they do come, not always by the most obvious means, I would say.
Yeah, lovely, thank you. And then lovely presentation. This is from Mary Trays. I have come across little metal numbered discs on some big trees in my local park. Can you tell me how I might find out more about these?
But when a tree survey is being carried out, so that the tree can be identified, they're assigned with little metal discs. So it's a number which refers to the report which is going with the tree survey. Now, tree surveys, people get alarmed when they see tree surveys being carried out. They can be for positive and for negative reasons. We hope it's positive. They're often carried out just to look at, to take a record of the health of the tree and to prescribe, for its future management. And I suspect, if it's in the parkland situation, that's why it's to maintain a record and to prescribe, proper management regime to ensure the longevity of the trees. But that's their sole functioning, really.
Mary is wondering how to help mountain ash that has been bent over with the winds.
Yeah, that's happening more and more, and I think it's perhaps in a maybe street situation or a pavement or where the root area is constricted. It can happen with mountain ash, and particular species of them would tend to be more prone to it. If it has gone over, and it is feasible to pull it back into position, depending on the size of the tree, if you can anchor it back in place with stakes, preferably steel bars would be more effective probably than wooden stakes. By all means, do. If it has gone right over, the likelihood of it recovering is probably quite slim, I would say, in real terms. And you may be better considering replanting it. But that is said, if there's still enough of the root in the ground, it's definitely well worth trying to pull it back in place if it's of a size that you can do that with.
Okay. Will all trees grow in all areas, or are species area specific? This is from Michael.
Okay. Certain trees will lend themselves to different types of conditions, I suppose. If you're in a coastal situation, for example, things like pines and evergreen oak, which I didn't mention this evening, tend to be more tolerant of the salt sprays and things like that. Whereas, beech and trees like that and oak and horse chestnut don't like that kind of situation. So yes, certainly there are species that relate to different types of growing conditions. So they're really, the suitability of a tree is determined by the conditions that are there. And there are different trees for different situations. Like, for example, I mentioned, alders and willows and that Pericaria being more suited to wet sites, whereas oak, doesn't particularly like having its feet sitting in wet, that kind of situation. So yes, there is. And, if you're looking to identify trees, any good tree nursery should be able to advise you on appropriate trees for the situations.
Okay, from Eileen, inspiring presentation. Thank you very much. Mary, thank you. It was brilliant. Anonymous Mary, thank you for a lovely presentation. Do you think that local authority 10-year tree 10-year strategies have worked to date where local authorities have them?
Yes, I do, because I was involved myself in drafting the tree strategy for South Dublin County Council, where I worked. It would have been one of the first tree strategies that was in the country. And certainly, it went a long way. The objective of any tree strategy is to set out a program for a fixed period for planting and management of trees. And in the lifetime of our first plan, we had a definite commitment to tree planting. We planted trees, more trees probably than we had done in quite a few years before that. And we put in place a very strategic and systematic system for maintaining trees to minimize, let's say, the nuisance value for the members of the public, and to begin to turn around public appreciation and perception that managed trees are perhaps much less nuisance than people perceive them to be, and that managed trees carry less risk as well in public's eyes. So certainly, yes, I think it's a slow process, certainly, but from the point of view of increasing planting and putting proper management regimes in place, it certainly was a great benefit.
Yeah. And can I just say, Mary, your colleagues in South Dublin County Council did a wonderful, I think it was South Dublin, a wonderful talk on natural play in during our European Greenleaf Year, and it was about things like climbing trees and not having the formal playgrounds necessarily, but natural spaces for young people to play in, or spaces that were for 0 to 94, that kind of thinking. Absolutely gorgeous presentation, and it's on the European Greenleaf YouTube channel. Another one, Mary, a fabulous talk, Mary, beautiful garden. Can you recommend for a small garden, what would you suggest putting into newly planted borders? Obviously don't want anything too big. I love acers, which are maples, I presume.
Right, acers. So obviously, if you don't want anything too big, the Japanese maples are nice to grow. There was an example there, the purple leafed one, which I showed, but there are many other forms of Japanese maple too, which are good. And the maples have quite attractive flowers on them. We don't always appreciate, we see all the lovely foliage colours that they have, but they actually produce quite nice flowers on them in the springtime as well. And the pollinators do like them. The other maple that I showed there too, the Acer Brilliantissimum, is a good compact tree, provided that it's top grafted. But other small growing trees that you might consider, too, that I haven't mentioned would be even some of things like euonymus or spindleberry, which can make a lovely small tree, make a lovely background tree in a border. And indeed, some of the cultivated forms of elder make lovely small trees in borders as well, and lovely flowers to them as well. And of course, you can have a go at making your elderflower cordials and all that sort of thing from it as well. So it'll give you many benefits. The flowering crabs too that I mentioned are great trees for small garden situations.
Yeah. There's a small crab or a couple of small crabs near where I live, and it would have been old farmland, I suppose, and they are probably there historically in what is like a very suburban housing estate, and they're absolutely gorgeous.
Yeah.
Mary, one of the questions that went into chat, the row of the row of oaks with the regeneration in between. Can you please say what distance you would allow between them and the old oaks? So the newly planted oaks and the old oaks.
A minimum of 10 meters would go between them, really, to give the tree, a chance for its crown to form a viable crown in years to come.
Okay.
Even with a new planting, I would put. Even with a new avenue planting, I would put them 10, even 20 meters apart.
Okay. Many thanks, Mary. Would you have any advice on planting trees successionally to avoid having a plantation of specimens all a similar age? That's from Kieran.
Yeah. I suppose here, like we have farmland here as well, and we've done that in one corner of the farm, where we put in a mix of oak for the long term as such. It was planted now about 15 years ago at this stage, when we could plant ash as well. So ash was planted sort of as an interim, and then we also planted hazel and alder sort of as the shorter term crop. So it's not so much successional. But the idea being, our purpose here is because we have a wood-fired boiler. We planted the hazel and the ash and the alder for, a source of firewood fuel in years to come. And when they're cut out, then we'll be left with the oak for the long-term development, and they're there for as a permanent crop as such. So, rather than planting a few trees every year, what we did was we planted for different rates of growth. And in effect, trees like the alders and the hazels and birch and things like that, they are what you call a nurse crop, so that they provide the kind of the sheltered conditions for longer term trees then like oak and pine and those to establish. So they kind of work hand in hand on a successional basis in that way.
Very interesting. This is from Rachel. Would you like to comment on the biodiversity value of conifers?
Yeah, I suppose, generally conifers tend to get bad press for their biodiversity value. And, certainly, I showed that the spruce plantation there, people have all sorts of views on the value of plantations like that for biodiversity. But, in a garden context, in a even in a residential context, in open space areas, they do have a place as, providing shelter for, nesting birds, and while they don't necessarily have any tremendous food value, they do provide a value in cover, and that's where I see the main merit. And of course, some of the plantations that you see do have a flora all of their own, a ground flora all of their own, which goes hand in hand with them as well, albeit it's much more limited than a native, deciduous woodland planting would have. As I said earlier, I suppose while I am a tree hugger, and certainly while I would promote native tree planting at every opportunity, I do think that any tree is good. And certainly, the coniferous trees have great value in terms of their ability to store carbon and to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So from the point of view of enhancing our climate change objectives, that's particularly where the conifers come in, I feel.
Yeah, and just an interesting one on that. I have to say that was at Sleep Bloom where the sickest spruce photograph was extraordinary. And because I
Yeah,
wouldn't be a mad fan of conifers at all, but I thought that was just beautiful. Just to say that the Scots pine is an indigenous tree, am I right, Mary?
yes, that's right. Yes, yeah.
And that is a conifer. And also something that we ran into recently.
And of course, you use a conifer as well.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Sorry,
yeah.
I was going to say Sinead, and of
No,
course the
no problem.
native Irish yew as well as conifer.
One of our local parks where we have, there's a bit of a conifer plantation as well as deciduous planting. And a local school has been going down there to do wilderness classes. Fabulous. They're using it beautifully. But they tend to use the conifer area because there's less undergrowth where they can spread out and work away in that. And then they move into the deciduous area for other parts of it. So it has, the mix has its benefits, you know.
Yeah.
Just a lovely comment from John Carney, who's the head of the Tidy Towns unit. Just wonderful presentation, Mary, such passion and generosity to share with us all. Loved the images. What a wealth of encouraging information in recent weeks for Tidy Towns groups in these difficult times. And it was a gorgeous presentation, Mary, absolutely. And our last question is from Caroline O'Dowd. Do you think, due to the current climate, that there will be a shortage of trees to plant? Interesting.
Yes, there is. There already is a shortage of trees to plant. You know, and it's not so much because of the restrictions, but Brexit is having an enormous impact. You know, and what I'm finding is that trying to source trees, because as mentioned, we have a nursery here. We're trying to source trees for groups that are trying to get, you know, bare root trees in at the moment, and all of the main suppliers of large size trees in Ireland are almost depleted. And apparently what happened last year was that many of the UK nurseries came and bought out our nurseries in the knowledge that their ability to import from then on was going to be limited. And so the stock that would have been available this year has all been bought up. But most of the nurseries have, you know, their own successional crops coming on as well. So that supply will be restored.
It makes a case, doesn't it, for seed harvesting and growing seedlings on? Yeah.
You know, it's a nice project, and I have seen many local groups and smaller tiny towns groups actually do that, and you know, start their own small little tree nursery in someone's back garden or in the back area of a community centre or something. You know, just gathering the conkers or gathering the acorns and growing them on. And you know, it's such a lovely local story to grow your own.
Absolutely.
Plant them back in the area. I think it's a great connection to give the younger people as well, with maybe something that they gathered and potted up, and then, you know, a couple of years later they're planting them out, and as they mature and as they all go grey like the rest of us, kind of, they'll say, I planted that tree and it was from the conker from the local tree. Lovely connection.
Mary, we'll close now because that's all our questions and comments. What a wonderful talk. You know, when we named it The Beauty of Trees, I had no idea. That was just fabulous. I loved every minute of it myself. I hope everybody else enjoyed it. Apologies, folks, if I'm going on too much myself, but I'm sure everybody did. And thank you so much for joining us this evening for our celebration of Tree Week. And a huge thank you to Mary for such a marvellous presentation in a very busy week for Mary. So thank you and good night, everybody.
Thank you so much, Sinead. I really appreciate the opportunity. Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.